Hello again. I'm sure that we're all aware that a determined effort has for some while been underway to prove that our multicultural society is nothing new, and that you would have seen just as rich a mixture of ethnicities on the streets of British cities in the Regency period, Tudor times, or even as far back as the Roman occupation or Stone Age. There's quite a cottage industry of turning out books and television documentaries and presentations for Black History Month, which are all designed to demonstrate this. Most of us know it's a fantasy, but it becomes increasingly difficult to say so without being called a racist. Indeed, if this carries on, then in 10 years' time, talking of the homogeneous white society of 18th century Britain will be regarded as historical revisionism or fake history. I'm sure that many young people in this country already half believe that to be the case, so relentlessly are they assaulted by the state's propaganda about diversity, both at school and via the BBC and so on. A few years ago, I was commissioned to write some guidebooks to London and was fascinated to come across a few genuine cases of black people living in London in both the 18th and 19th century. What made these men interesting is the fact that they were freakishly rare exceptions to the general rule, which was, of course, that everybody around was at that time white. Take Caesar Picton, for example. This is a guidebook I wrote to Kingston upon Thames. If you look here, you can see somewhere an American colonial style house. It's very unusual. Caesar Picton was a freed slave, black guy, and he lived there in the late 18th century, became a coal merchant and a very well-to-do person. Became a gentleman, even had the vote at that time, which was quite unusual for people of such humble origins. We also know that one black man was living in Kensington in 1882. But he was such an unusual sight that gangs of children would follow him about in the street, something which they would hardly do if there had been any substantial number of black people living in London at that time. Let me just read out, this is the guide to Kensington and Chelsea. Let me read out what I wrote. Some of the juxtapositions of blue plaques in Kensington and Chelsea are jaw-droppingly bizarre. On the side of an unremarkable block of Victorian flats in Melbury Road, just off Kensington High Street, are two blue plaques, one above the other. One tells us that William Holman Hunt, founder of the pre-Raphaelite artistic movement, lived here during the late 19th century. This is all very right and proper. The pre-Raphaelites mostly lived in the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea at one time or another. The other plaque, though, tells us that while Holman Hunt was living here in 1882, King Cetshwayo, leader of the Zulu nation, moved in next door. One cannot help but wonder at this peculiar circumstance. Did the exiled king of the Zulus pop round to Holman Hunt's studio in order to borrow a cup of sugar or a shilling for the gas meter? Nobody denies that there was the odd black person in Britain in those days, together with Chinese people and a few Indians. They were so rare, though, that they were the object of curiosity whenever they appeared in public. Another example is that when I was a child, my grandfather took me to Trafalgar Square, and he pointed out that there was a black sailor shown in the bas relief on the base of the column as having taken part in the Battle of Trafalgar. This man may be seen in the thumbnail to this video. Again, very rare exception to the general rule of white society. What has happened in the last few years is that these very few cases have been taken, they've been amplified by writers such as David Olusoga and presented as being the generality. They've been presented as being the norm rather than exceptions. So we end up with productions like the television series Bridgerton and so on. I thought it worth mentioning this because there's a great deal of deception being undertaken here. You'll see the same few black people. There's a goddaughter of Queen Victoria, for example. They are presented time and again in different guises, and the intention is to make it look as though there were a lot more of them than there were. In fact, in the 18th and 19th century, there were perhaps half a dozen black people in London. Most of those were living down by the docks at that time. Britain was a homogeneous white society, and this was the state of affairs that continued right through until the end of the Second World War.